as in Thomas, E as in Edward, L as in Louis, U, S as in Sam, M as in Mary, A. By the time I was 5 years old, I heard both my mother and father use this clever way of spelling my last name so people could understand. Both my name and my family are indigenous to the Republic of Haiti, and Haitians throughout much of the 20th century faced challenge in both dictatorship and US intervention. At the peak of that intervention, my parents understood that the best opportunity for their children to succeed in an increasingly globalized society was to have them born and raised in the United States. However, the struggle to assimilate manifested even in the smallest interactions like spelling out your last name. And for good reason. In American society, the last name is important. It represents heritage and a land stolen from indigenous individuals. It represents a blessing in certain religious communities and a symbol of power. However, success and access for people who look like me can be just as foreign as our last name. I mean, for decades, we've measured immigrant success on how well they're able to integrate into a society that hasn't always been willing to assimilate them into it. I mean, even politicians, in defense of immigrants and immigrants' rights, will cite statistics like the number of immigrants with higher education degrees being more than twice the rate than that of US-born citizens. Politicians in opposition to immigrants and immigrants' rights will cite the number of undocumented individuals currently in the United States as a reason for concern. However, neither side of the argument really paints a cohesive picture of the struggles of this community. And that's problematic because the United States perpetuates this image that it cultivates its growth around immigrants, which is true. At least I know it's true for my family. Because despite our rough start in the United States, we went from struggle to secure. In 2005, my dad became a licensed physician in the United States. And in December of 2018, my mother earned her master's degree and is currently studying for her boards to become a nurse practitioner. All three of their kids are either working and in school, and I, their middle child. I'm a first-year law student at the Florida A&M University College of Law in Orlando, Florida. So by all accounts, we are the successful immigrant story. By merely picking ourselves up by our own bootstraps, we were able to achieve, striving, and enterprising. Our story would be typecast in Hollywood as your typical rags to riches story. However, for many immigrants, especially the undocumented, in getting here and developing wealth and income and achieving basic human rights like housing, their reality mirrors more closely with Langston Hughes' dream deferred, which brings me to my first point. There is a fundamental problem with how we treat the undocumented trying to enter the United States. And that's due in part to the expansion of an industrial complex that jails and detains immigrants. What has gone from 5,000 daily detainees in 1991 has ballooned to over 40,000 detainees in 2017. And in 2018, in a 5-3 decision, the United States Supreme Court stated that the undocumented can be held indefinitely while waiting for a deportation proceeding or to make their case to stay in the United States. This is problematic because it not only reveals the contempt that we hold towards the undocumented, but reveals how we profit off their detention. 63% of these detention facilities are privately owned and operated. And unfortunately, the system will use a combination of policy and pandering to perpetuate the problem, with the latter being just as dangerous as the former. You see, around the time I was applying to law school, President Donald Trump allegedly made comments referring to Haiti, among other countries, as a shithole country. And in each one of my diversity statements, kidding you not, I had started with when Donald Trump referred to Haiti as a shithole country, because at the time it seemed like the noble thing to do, but probably contributed to some rejection letters. It's okay, I understand. I'm human. But it's deeply problematic because that rhetoric had empowered both members of the executive branch and radical fringe groups alike to increase their targeting of vulnerable communities that were set to lose temporary protection status. And ultimately, that makes a lot of the work that I want to do as an attorney that much harder. Even more so because these people are human. And they have stories a lot like my own. They have human rights that ought not to be violated. And my staying and their potential deportation should not come at the expense of a piece of paper. Because while yes, early American minds had names like Washington and Franklin and Adams and Jefferson, they also had names like Jean Point du Sable, the first non-indigenous individual to settle what is now Chicago, Illinois. He had the opportunity to make home an area that he was not native to, which brings me to my second point. For those that are able to stay, the road to achieve the most basic human rights like housing is a difficult one. And if you think about, in 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act provided a massive overhaul of who had access to federal public benefits. And as it stands, the undocumented don't have the opportunity to receive welfare or federal housing funding because they don't fall into that proper classification again, revealing the contempt that we hold towards the undocumented, but also showing how the United States has historically been exclusionary in how it's developed its cities. Even as an immigrant, if you come with the proper documentation, starting from scratch can be difficult because I know this to be true for my family. When my dad came to the United States, he started from scratch. But what he and my mother have contributed to this country as medical professionals, in my eyes, is immeasurable. But part of that sacrifice was starting out of my grandmother's house. It was one tiny house with upwards of 10 people. That's actually a picture of me playing in that house. I know. It was really nice having hair at the top of my head. God. But the point that I'm trying to make, that even my parents had a rough time trying to participate in the enterprise of home ownership because the federal government had not prioritized that. And even the right to home ownership is protected in our US Constitution, both commonly in the 5th and 14th Amendments protect this right because the framers understood the importance of home ownership. And as it stands right now, a group that contributes over $20 billion annually in federal taxes cannot participate in that right. And you think about the fact that a piece of land with your last name on it is something that can't be overstated. You see it as it develops in value and gets passed down from generation to generation. Meanwhile, the average undocumented family of 3 only makes $36,000 a year, which stifles even greater ambition that I talk about in a poem that I wrote actually here as a freshman in Beatty Towers West. Because spoken word poetry is actually my first trade. And in the piece I write, I don't know if you just didn't know this or didn't bother to notice, but dressing well for my people is another relevant form of protest. And as I protest, I speak my hopes into existence. See, in about 25 years' time, I'm going to be standing behind a podium with the aptly titled acronym of POTUS. And if you didn't understand what I said, I will rewind it for you. I'll break it down. A wise man once told me, you know you've made it if they can pronounce your foreign last name correctly. Till this day, there are people that like to mispronounce the last name Telusma for the fun of it. But in 25 years' time, you won't say my last name unless the word president comes in front of it. I'm not trying to be... I'm not trying to be extra. I'm telling you the truth. I'm going to shake the shackles off your ankles. I'm going to wake up you. But even in the context of that poem, I understand the limitations of those ambitions. That one position cannot solve a systemic problem. And the notion that by merely picking yourself up by your own bootstraps, you can achieve away an oppressive system is entirely a myth. And your proximity to privilege doesn't necessarily equate to your survival. Think of Shia bin Abraham Joseph, or rapper 21 Savage. His relative release from an ICE detention center didn't solve the issue of ICE unfairly and unjustly targeting undocumented individuals all across the country. Think of real estate billionaire Jorge M. Perez. His success in the housing industry didn't solve the housing crisis for the undocumented, for immigrants, and frankly for Americans all across the country. And when we challenge policymakers and politicians to craft policy from the margins of society, we can experience a freer and truer sense of liberation. And then maybe we can get to a society in which the last name Gonzalez is synonymous with the last name Gates, or Saint-Hilaire is synonymous with the last name Sandberg, or even Telusma, synonymous with the last name Truman. Thank you, and God bless.